Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are logging on from in the world, and welcome to this FIDIC webinar, which is our final webinar of 2022. And today's event is going to focus on mitigating the impact of working in disaster and conflict zones. My name is Andy Walker. I'm the communications advisor for FIDIC, and I'd like to welcome you all and thank you all for logging on to today's event. We think it's quite a topical event to discuss today. Currently, over 20 countries are in a state of conflict or post-conflict reconstruction and development. And we've also seen many more affected by natural disasters in the course of 2022. And as has been demonstrated by the increasing number of disasters and conflicts around the world, including the current one in Europe that we're all very aware of. International financial institutions, clients, contractors, and consulting engineers have to deal with many challenging issues when they're working in zones of the world where these issues are prevalent. And we also know as well that the IFIs and the multilateral development banks play a critical role in delivering projects in areas affected by conflicts and disasters. And we're going to be discussing some of those issues and how we deal with those issues during the course of today's webinar itself. And of course, there are many issues that need to be discussed in relation to conflict and in relation to disasters. And we have a really excellent panel who are going to help us today take a bit of a deep dive into some of those issues so that we can basically get some clarity and hopefully map a way forward when working in those kinds of areas. The webinar today will also share the experiences of our speakers in dealing with some of those issues, and also the issues that various project stakeholders have had when working in disaster and conflict zones. As I said, we have an excellent panel today to talk us through all of that. But before we introduce everyone, it's my great pleasure to ask FIDIC board member Manish Kothari, who is also president and CEO of Shiladia Associates, which is an international architecture and engineering consulting firm based in Rockville, Maryland in the US, to say a few words to open our proceedings today. So Manish, the floor is yours.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. And thank you, Andy, for that kind introduction. I'm Manish Kothari. I'm delighted to welcome you all here today on behalf of the FIDIC President, Tony Barry, CEO Nelson Ogunshakin, members of the board, and the FIDIC International Financial Institutions Committee to this important webinar on mitigating the impact of working in disaster and conflict zones. We are grateful to the efforts of the FIDIC IFI committee for organizing today's event, and in particular to committee members Richard Crow from Nicholas O'Dwyer in Ireland, Mark Steiner from US, and Mansour from the Middle East. As we know, the IFIs and the multilateral development banks play a critical role in delivering projects in areas that are affected by conflicts and disasters around the world, and in the reconstruction of these areas that are in these situations. Unfortunately, given the increasing uncertainty we face in our world today, these challenges are becoming more and more complex and common, and our industry is often at the sharp end of grappling with them. International financial institutions, clients, contractors, and consulting engineers must deal with a myriad of challenging issues when they are working in disaster and conflict zones. During the course of this webinar, we hope to share the experiences gained in dealing with these challenges and to explore how their impacts on work performance can best be mitigated. We have a great panel lined up to discuss the topics for you today, and we are very fortunate to have a keynote address from Etel Berlowski, procurement manager for the MENA region for the World Bank in Egypt. We are really grateful for Etel's input, and FIDIC really values the relationship that we have with World Bank and indeed with all the international multilateral development banks bilateral agencies, and other funding organizations around the world. In the words of Kobe Bryant, every conflict, challenge, negative pressure is an opportunity for us to rise, learn, and be better of ourselves. So without much further ado, I'll now hand over to Andy, Communications Advisors at FIDIC, who will be moderating our webinar today. Back to you, Andy.
Thanks very much, Manish, for those words. And I think it's fair to say as well, as Manish has pointed out earlier, we're really grateful for all of the work of the International Financial Institutions Committee of FIDIC for pulling together today's webinar. In fact, Manish is and was the first chair of that committee, and he helped to pioneer the committee's partnership with purpose approach around all of these issues when dealing with the IFIs. So thank you very much to him for that. Before we start the main part of the webinar, we just want to kick things off with a little poll for our audience. What's the biggest risk to project delivery in areas affected by disaster or conflict? It's a multiple choice question, so just pick one answer, or indeed the bottom one, all of the above. Safety and security, contractual obligations, payments, or all of the above. We'll just give you 10 seconds or so to select your answer on that, and then we'll throw up the answer on the screen before we get going with our first speaker. So that's what we've got there. Hopefully, my colleagues in the background will put the results on the screen. And as I suspected, the answer is all of the above. So safety and security is a risk, contractual obligations is a risk, and also payments is a risk as well. So as we can see, quite a lot of risk to be dealt with when working in these areas of the world. And we're going to discuss, as Manish pointed out earlier, some of these issues in greater detail now. And we're really, really fortunate and very grateful that to start the webinar off, we have Etel Bereslavsky, who is the procurement manager for the Middle East and North Africa region at the World Bank, based in Egypt. And Etel is going to be talking about the bank's tools and the flexibility permitted under its procurement framework to address procurement and contract challenges and risks in the implementation of the bank's finance projects in conflict areas. I'm sure Etel will touch on a few examples from around the world, and she'll also refer to some of the other tools that can be used to help contractors and consulting firms, but also government agencies when they're implementing projects in challenging situations. We're really fortunate to have Etel, and as I said, we're very grateful, and we're grateful to the World Bank for their input on this. So Etel, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me clearly. Yes. So thank you, Andy. Thank you, Manish, for the introduction. This is my great pleasure to be here. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all attendees connected from different parts of the world. It's my honor to share this webinar with the distinguished speakers and with all of you, and to talk about the World Bank experience in working in disaster and conflict zones, but also my great pleasure to hear from the private sector. It is a very good opportunity for the World Bank to hear from you and to learn from you. So as it was introduced already, I am the practice manager, procurement manager based in Cairo. I am from Argentina. I am a civil engineer. I work in the consulting industry for many, many years, so I can understand the feelings of the consulting firms working in this kind of countries. I have 30 years of experience. I work in different countries, the continents, Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Now, as I said, I'm based in Cairo. I work in the MENA region, which is the Middle East and North Africa, and it includes conflict countries, conflict areas like Iraq, Yemen, Palestine, Djibouti, and Lebanon. So my keynote today will refer to some of these experience in working on those countries, although the World Bank, as already mentioned, is working in many other conflict areas like Myanmar, Afghanistan, Ukraine, Haiti, Mali, and Simon will share his experience in working in Ukraine, I guess so. So as it was said already, the multilateral development banks play a critical role in delivering projects in this kind of conflict areas. But just to set the scenario with some numbers, so you get familiar with the portfolio of the World Bank. The World Bank works in 144 countries around the world. In 2021, the World Bank's portfolio includes 1,800 projects with a total commitment of 221 billion. And we work in different sectors, in transport, in water, in health, education, energy, agriculture, just to name a few. And this, of course, includes procurement of all kinds of works, consulting services, goods, equipment, IT systems. And the huge portfolio of the bank is in the Africa region, in sub-Saharan region, where most of the fragile countries lies there. So works in those countries, as already mentioned, pose a lot of challenges that have been exacerbating during the last 3 years with the pandemic and now with the war in Iraq, with immediate consequences known to all of us and specifically to you in terms of lockdown, supply chain disruptions, high rates of inflation, political turmoil, social unrest. So the question is how the World Bank deals or have dealt with these challenges during the last years and more recently. But before responding to that question, I just want to say that you, the consulting firms, the construction industry, individual consultants, play a key role in helping us to develop and to implement our projects. We also have key partners with UN agencies, NGOs that are also helping us in achieving the goals, the sustainable development goals and fighting poverty. But for you to work in our projects, we provide a lot of tools, a lot of documents, policies, procurement documents that can help you to compete in equal and a fair manner in our projects. So we want to ensure a level playing field for the private sector with opportunities and fair treatment to all of those. So how we can predict, how we can address all these challenges that we see in this kind of environments. So when the projects are prepared, the projects have to take into account all the challenges that can be addressed at the time the project is being implemented. So, and then to provide mitigation measures in the project appraisal document that is the Bible of the project that is available in our website. But there is a key tool that we have introduced in 2016 under the procurement framework, and this is the project procurement strategy for development. This is a document, this is the methodology that has to be followed up by the client, by the government agencies that are those implementing the project to address all the challenges that are related to implementing contracts to the market. So to understand which are the risks, inflation, insecurity, lack of materials, all these issues are being detailed in the PPSD in this document. So in that document, we define whether we can use more competitive procedures or less competitive according to the market situation, also whether to use lump sum contract versus time-based contract, also to address inflation, how to include formulas for price adjustments since the beginning, whether to use a direct selection, as I said. So, and how to estimate the cost, which is the methodology to estimate the cost considering the externalities in those countries. So this is a very important document. And now I want to share briefly some experience for the MENA region and how the bank operates in those environments. For example, in Yemen, the bank does not have any presence there, so we rely on UN agencies. UN agencies, we have about 14 projects implemented with UN agencies, and those are implemented following the UN agency's procurement procedures. It's not the procurement framework that applies, it's just the UN procurement procedures. And this is being allowed under the procurement framework because the UN agency procedures are aligned with the principles of the procurement framework. In that sense, the UN agencies hire consulting firms, hire contractors, hire suppliers to implement the projects. And these are supervised by a third-party monitoring hired by UN agencies. In Iraq, we have presence in Iraq, but due to the difficulties to travel in several areas, the bank hired a consulting firm to monitor and to supervise projects. This is a multi-year consulting contract, is open to competition, everyone can participate, and this third-party monitoring ensures report on the bank on how the projects are implemented. But despite the environment in Iraq, I need to say that there is a huge competition from external consulting firms and local firms. We have about 50% of the contracts awarded to local firms, another 50% awarded to international. So despite the challenges, we have a good level of competition. Another tool that the bank provides in countries with low capacity is the hands extended implementation support, meaning the bank can help directly the implementing agency to prepare the bidding documents, to conduct the procurement process, to help the contract management. The ultimate decision is on the client, on the government agency, but this has shown that we can help you because the procurement process is faster, but also the disbursement are being accelerated. We also offer in these countries like Lebanon with a high increase, high inflation, direct payment to contractors and consulting firms. So this can solve the issue of cash flow. And direct contracting is another option when the market is not capable to meet our demands. But also shopping. You know that shopping is a very straightforward procurement process where firms are invited directly, contractors, 3 minimum contractors, so we can increase the threshold that normally shopping is being used for small value contracts to higher value contracts. So in a nutshell, we have been adapted ourselves. Also, we have seen that during this crisis, there is a lot of amendments in contracts, and I think the contract conditions, and it was one of the pool questions, and I think the FIDIC allows sufficient room, space, to introduce changes in the contract, to accept amendments when they are justified, even to include price adjustment, to change the formula for the price adjustment according to the situation. But just as, I don't know if I have more time, Andy, or I need to close.
I think you've got a couple of minutes left.
Okay, so I just want to finalize my keynotes. I just want to mention a few issues that we have detected in these environments that are also difficult for consulting and constructions companies. Sometimes there is an overuse of subcontractors when this was not allowed in the contract. So many contractors, instead of implementing the project, relies on subcontractors that do not have necessarily the capacity of the contractor. So this is an issue that we have been seeing in these fragile environments. Also, consulting firms often change much frequently the key staff members and replace those with staff that do not necessarily have the capacity of the original the key staff member. Another important issue is a dispute and resolution board. I think this is very important to include those in the contract at the outset, because the role of this dispute adjudication board is fundamental to solve issues that likely will happen in these environments. So I think this is a matter of all working together. We providing to you all the necessary support, the documents, the tools, the complaint mechanism for you to raise any issue, but also on your side to help us to implement the projects with the best possible good practices. So with that, I think I have summarized how we work in these environments, which are the tools that we provide. And we are always open to hear from the private sector and learn from them in how they work in these challenging times. Thank you very much, Andy, and I am ready for any question during the webinar.
Okay, Etel, thanks very much for that contribution, and we'll clearly come back with some questions when we get to the Q&A. It was really interesting to hear you mention some of the documentation that the World Bank makes available. I don't know whether or not you're able to put into the chat box any of the links to those documents if they are available, because we have had a request. And I think our audience would find that useful as well. So that would be very, very helpful. We can share them anyway in the report that will appear as if by magic on the FIDIC website after this webinar has finished. But feel free to put those links into the chat as well. For the moment, Etel, thanks very much, but we will be returning to you during the Q&A. Our next speaker is a government minister from the government of Maldives, Mohammed Aslam, who is the Minister of National Planning, Housing and Infrastructure, a tremendously important department within the Maldives government. And I was just looking in preparation for today's event at the government of the Maldives website, and the aim of Mohammed's department is to build an interconnected and equal nation that leaves no one behind, which I think is an extremely laudable aim, and one which I think every nation should be aspiring to. His department oversees the establishment and implementation, amongst other things, of the National Development Plan in the Maldives, and obviously works with the relevant government authorities to ensure that that plan and plans meet the various national development milestones. So Mohammed's going to talk to us now for a number of minutes to give his view on this very important subject. Mohammed, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andy, and thank you for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be part of this webinar. To start with, I believe I would like to redefine, the conflict zones now. I think the global community is so interconnected, linked, that what happens in one part of the region of the world, affects every other part of the world. And this happens more when, in certain areas, especially, the current situation where we're in. What happens very far away from us in Europe is having a very direct impact on us. So that's having a direct impact on, the supply chain. And, what happens, although not a conflict, but, China hasn't come out of the pandemic still. And what happens, in China, the policies of the Chinese government on zero COVID, all of these things have, a great impact on, on what happens, everywhere else in the world. So we should not be focusing, when we talk about conflict zones, it should not be, limited to, the immediate geographic boundaries of those zones. That's the nature of the global community right now. So I think that's where I want to start with. We've had one major disaster, not talk about the pandemic, the tsunami of 2004. That was the time when we experienced a disaster of that scale in the Maldives. And lots of international consultants, contractors, engineering firms, and everybody were here. Lots of multilateral agencies working in the Maldives with the local contractors and local parties. Things went rather well, and what we saw was that the international multilateral agencies were having, playing a key role in those. I guess that's what would happen anywhere in the world when there's a major disaster, international agencies and they come in with higher capacity. They come in and fill in the gaps. Since then, we've not had, thank God, and hope, at least don't hope that anything like that would ever happen here in the Maldives. So when we talk about, I am very sympathetic to contractors. Of course, as Andy rightly mentioned that, I happen to oversee the government's infrastructure development program and making plans for, macro level national development plans. But it also comes down, so I start with that, at the planning level, and then come down to implementing some of those plans, especially when it's related to infrastructure. There are, major infrastructure works that are happening here in the country. Some of them, executed by, foreign contractors, some with local contractors. And often some of these contracts have started even before, the start of war in Europe, and the problems that caused and the disruption it has. So the contracts don't actually envisage, that sort of thing. Because it is not directly a conflict zone, the clauses of force majeure does not apply to these things. And so I don't think the form of contract may be very good, but in the particular conditions, these things are not really addressed. So I am very keen to learn and hear from the participants and the discussions we have, how we deal with that sort of things. It's not. We should be able to protect the contractors as the biggest client, the government. We have a very strong hand, but it's in no interest of the government to have a heavy hand on the contractors and then make them go strictly by the contractual terms. Some level of flexibility has to be sought, but at the same time, we are obliged to follow the contract to the letter as well. So how do we actually come out of those things is something I am keen to learn. When something has happened after that, we've signed into a contract, and once and not in a direct conflict zone. I know when it is the direct conflict zone, many other clauses start kicking in. So that's something. This is why I wanted to redefine what a conflict zone is. And it's good to know that the World Bank has these documentations that was mentioned can be very helpful guides for us. So that's what it is. And I'll be quite happy to answer any specific questions. But would like to see the contracts and ways of being reasonable, yet not create other sorts of problems in dealing with the contractors, the engineers, and everybody else who are parties to the contract. And not at the initial stage of agreeing on the terms of the contract, but after we've actually entered into a contract. So that's something I believe, at least at this moment in time, we need to address. And because a lot of work that we've started, before the conflict, in places very far away from us. So yeah, I would stop there and would be happy to answer any questions. And thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you very much indeed for that. And I think you make a really important point there about the need to perhaps redefine what we mean when we talk about disaster and conflict zones. And I think it was really good that you actually made the point about the interconnected world in which we now live. That, the fact that an unpredicted, conflict thousands and thousands of miles away, like what we've got in Central Europe at the present time, can have such a profound effect, not only on different industries, but the whole of the world economy. And it does really show, doesn't it, if we ever needed it to be underlined once more, how interconnected we are as a world, and that one, nation's issues and problems are going to affect other ones, and we clearly do live more and more in a connected world, and we really need to be aware of that. Thanks for your contribution, Mohammed. We'll obviously hear from you more in the discussion that we're about to have once our speakers have spoken. Next up, we have Simon Cherwa, who is a procurement manager for the Europe and Central Asia region at the World Bank. And as I'm sure people are aware, the World Bank works with countries across Europe and Central Asia with the core purpose of eliminating poverty and promoting shared prosperity by boosting human capital, enabling markets, supporting a green transition, and also working to build and strengthen institutions. So Simon, over to you for your insights. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Simon Cherwa. I'm the Practice of Procurement Manager at the World Bank, responsible for Europe and Central Asia, based here in Washington, D.C. It's quite early here in Washington, D.C. First, I'd like to thank FIDIC for organizing this webinar. I think we should be talking quite often with the industry to learn what is working and what is not working. Working in this type of places requires a lot of attention, and hearing from the industry would be something that the World Bank would be very keen to learn. And I think in the course of this webinar, I also hope to learn from the participants. I have worked in these conflict areas ranging from South Sudan, Myanmar, and currently, as the others have already indicated, now we are dealing with Ukraine. In many cases where the World Bank has worked, it has been in situations where there's been ceasefire, and countries or warring parties have signed some agreement, and there's some return to normality. But the situation we are working now in Ukraine is very unique in that it's an active hostility zone. So the question comes, how do contractors or consultants deliver in an area of active conflict? There are certain things which we take for granted. For example, we always take for granted that there will be an employer who is party to the contract. But what do you do if in the middle of the contract implementation, there is no employer? You can't make any amendments, you can't have anybody to contact. What do you do? These are some of the situations that we are facing in Ukraine. What do you do in a country like Ukraine, where when young men are called into active duty, and then immediately you have a shortage of workforce? How can you implement contracts under those type of situations? We have in our contracts some risk mitigation measures, such as requiring contractors to provide bank guarantees, to provide insurance. But in a country or situation like Ukraine, you cannot get a bank guarantee. You cannot get insurance. Nobody is willing to insure anything. And if they would, it would be at a very high premium. So how do you work in such type of environment? Now, working in these areas, despite the challenges that I have stated, requires speed. Okay. It also requires a lot of flexibility, but at the same time, there's high demand on integrity. As you know, this type of situation have a big issue with integrity, with corruption. And there are so many undocumented stories of corrupt practices being perpetrated in these war and conflict zones. So how do you ensure that there is integrity in the contract management, in the procurement process, and in the management of funds? So these are some of the challenges that we are grappling with. Now, the FIDIC contract provides a very good, solid foundation in dealing with these issues. But I might say that the contracts we have today are premised on a stable and certain environment. And the environment that we have today, where the scope of work itself is changing rapidly as you implement. As I said, where you may have no employer at all, how you deal with such type of things. I think these require a different thinking. If you look at the role of engineer in the FIDIC contract and the regulated time frame which the engineer has to take decisions, these type of arrangements are not consistent with the conflict zones where decisions need to be taken very quickly. I would ask, as part of the debate, as a part of the learning, that we think of some simple but much more flexible contracts that could be used in this type of arrangement. In the end, in this conflict zone, while you can try to mitigate risk by many provisions, most of those provisions would not work. I think in the end, the employer has to take a lot of the risks. So I think that we have to recognize. Putting up very rigorous documents and trying to protect ourselves is not something that works in this type of environment. I'll stop here, but I just wanted to incite that that mindset on how we work in these type of environments and call to participants to sort of do much more soul searching in terms of the instrument we have and in terms of the arrangements we have and how best we can work in these conflict zones. Thank you so much. And I look forward to more questions and perhaps sharing how from the bank perspective, we have worked with consultants and contractors to deal with these uncertain environments. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon, for those comments. And I think it is important to raise the issue of are the contracts that we're using across the piece suitable when circumstances change. I think it's fair to say that FIDIC prides itself on the flexibility of those contracts. But at the same time, obviously, some of the situations that we're discussing here today are, in some cases, extreme, in some cases, very complex. And I think it's important that we do actually discuss how best that we operate in these kind of areas. And I think the points that you raised about the need for almost extreme flexibility, really, in the approach is actually quite an important point. Just before we get into our Q&A session and discussion with the panelists, we've got our final speaker to be introduced today, and that's Tamer Al-Felakawi, who is a regional manager for the Kuwait Fund for Economic Development. This fund is the Kuwait's agency for the provision and administration of financial and technical assistance to developing countries. The fund extends loans to finance development projects in its sphere of influence, and it also provides technical assistance to finance the cost of feasibility studies for projects as well. So, Tamer, the floor is yours, and we look forward to hearing your insights. Over to you.
Thank you, Andy. Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon and good evening. Allow me first of all to thank FEDIC for inviting Kuwait Fund to this webinar, which is very important to talk about very important subject, mitigating the impact working in disaster and conflict zone. As you rightly mentioned, Kuwait Fund for Arab Economic Development is an institution of the state of Kuwait that was established in 1961. We have about 62 years old of experience in developing projects around the Middle East and around the world. We have projects in 107 countries. As you know, that the area around Kuwait suffered a lot of disaster and war since they established. Before the Arab Spring and during the Arab Spring, Kuwait Fund played a very important role, and we has emerged for the past decade as a global partner in the humanitarian assistance. And with the as you rightly mentioned, we provide concessional soft loans to the borrowing countries, as well as we provide them with the technical assistance that is needed for preparation of visibility studies and technical assistance for to solve and mitigate some of the impact that was needed in some of the countries. We have our portfolio, it's up to 23 billion US dollars. We have about 30 projects per year that we provide to the borrowing countries. And we partner with other institutions such as the World Bank and the African Development Group. And we are part of a very important group called the Arab Coordination Group that consists of the Saudi Fund, Qatar Fund, Abu Dhabi Fund, Islamic Development Bank, OPEC Fund, and the Arab Fund for Social and Economic Affairs. So together with those institutions, we kind of get together to finance the project needed. As Mike, other panelists mentioned, we are interconnected, and the partnership between all of us is widely needed. We have, aside of our financial engagement, we also administer the grants and the financial resources straight from the government of Kuwait that is being allocated to solve certain issues. Most of the financial assistance from the state of Kuwait went to help ease the burden on the refugees, the Syrian refugees around the countries around Syria, and Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, and some of Iraq. We had managed to implement some of the emergency project to help install the refugees in the recipient countries. So that's it for now. We are being guided by flexible guidelines and policy and flexible policies, and this help us to move fast to address certain issues and certain requests from the borrowers. We really appreciate and we value the role of the consultants. We believe that it's our eyes on the site. We don't have offices. We have only one office that has opened in 2006 in Lebanon to help the reconstruction after the Israeli-Lebanese war. So at the moment, we have no offices in the regions, so that we always favor to finance the consultancy services, because we know they will keep, they are like our eyes on the site, and we rely largely on their documentation and progress reports. That's it for now, and I can add some more during the questionnaire. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tamer, for that, and particularly those comments about the role of the consultants play in working within your, with your organisation. I also think that a key theme that's coming through, and all of our speakers have mentioned it so far, and that's the role of partnership and working together. And I think, some of the areas that you mentioned just then, Tamer, that are big, where people are addressing some of the issues that have arisen from conflict. A lot of people in the world, I think, don't see this sector, this industry, as being part of that reconstruction and rebuilding effort. And obviously, it stands to reason that reconstruction, that rebuilding needs to take place when we've had, whether it be disasters, whether it be wars and so on and so forth. And I think it's important that we actually do highlight the role that's played, by the infrastructure sector, but also those funding organisations like your own and all the others around the table today play in all of that. Because at the end of the day, we have to move on, if we can, from some of these events around the world. And it's only by working in close partnership that we can actually do that. We're going to now move into a discussion, a Q&A session, where I'm going to pose some questions to our panel today. And I want to start off with one, if I may, and that's, I'm going to return back to Tamer if I can. And again, other panelists, feel free to jump in on this as well. In your opinion, Tamer, what are the most effective interventions in conflict or disaster zones that you have seen, maybe in the recent period, and how were those managed? Could you reflect on that and give us your views on that if you can?
Yeah, as I started my introduction, Kuwait Fund, we have the classic way of funding projects, by receiving the request, studying it in-house, sending the appraisal team to the borrowing countries, then we get engaged, we get the internal approval, then we go ahead and start financing the project, and then all follow the contracting and the consulting services and all this. And also we have a flexible guidelines and policies that help us also deal with countries under a certain conflicts. And we managed to do so in many areas, as I rightly mentioned. In Lebanon, we had no choice but to open an office, temporary office in Lebanon, to directly deal with the reconstruction effort, and we managed to do so. And we created a mechanism that the payment will go directly to the beneficiaries, consultants and contractors, to have the cash flow reaching faster to the reconstruction effort. And also we have, as I mentioned, we have many projects that we work on around the region, where we manage to finance and in the reinstallment effort in some area, but in some disaster and area where we cannot go ourselves, we partner, like the panelists from the World Bank mentioned. We partner with the UN agencies to implement some of the project, for example, in Yemen and in some area where they will be using their own procurement procedure and guidelines in order to help us implement some of the project that we found it that is needed during the conflicts.
Thanks very much for that, Tamer. Another question now as well, and I'm going to address this, if I may, to Etel. Delays resulting from disruptions, as has already been said, can often persist over a relatively long period. How can we deal fairly with delays in the commencement or continuance of work? Do you have any view on that?
Thank you, Andy. This is a very difficult question to answer because delays are often seen in any kind of contract. I mean, it's rarely to see that a works contract, even in non-conflict areas are implemented on time. So, I mean, this is a recurrent issue all over our portfolio, and we allow amendments of contracts to extend. I mean, some amendments which we have a distinguish between large value contracts where any change has to be approved by the bank, and small value contracts where any amendment can be handled by the procurement officer, by the government. So in small value contracts, this can be addressed quickly if there is a justification. And I think the FIDIC contract conditions allows for these amendments on time extensions and also scope change. And for large value contracts, of course, this has to be approved, these substantial changes by the procurement team, by the procurement officer if the value is large. So, I mean, the often problem here is that implementing agencies or governments are not educated how to handle amendments, how to handle changes on the contract. And this is the key issue that we face. So it's important that the consultants firms, the contractors justify thoroughly the change or the additional time needed. If there is not a clear justification, a sound justification for the contractors, the consulting firm, this is difficult to be handled in a speedy manner. So I think on one side, the contractors have to prepare this in a very informative manner. And in another side, the employer has to be educated how to approve this quickly. But of course, each country has its bureaucratic procedures. Some amendments in some countries are processed quicker, in others no. So it depends on the context if we are working on. But as Simon said, we need to exercise flexibility, and taking quick decisions are crucial in these conflict environments, because if not taken rapidly, can have very negative impacts. So we have all a role to play from the contractor and the consulting side to prepare this justification for amendment, and also us to help employers to take quick decisions on those and avoid abuse. We have a case on an amendment for price adjustment in one contract, large contract, in which the price adjustment was not justified because all the items that were required to be amended had not been increased. The inflation did not affect those items. So we need also to understand that these amendments should not provide any room for abuse for any party. Thank you, Andy. I hope I responded the question.
No, that's an excellent response to that. And I'm just going to sort of dig a little bit kind of deeper into the wider issue. And I want to just ask Mohammed to respond on something. And I was struck when you spoke, Mohammed, that you mentioned that you thought there was a need to maybe look again and try and redefine what we mean by, kind of disaster, sort of conflict, what that all means, because I think there is actually a link here in addressing some of these issues, from the contractual side as well. How would you like to see that conversation progress in terms of maybe looking to redefine some of that? And is it possible to have an open conversation around some of these issues, particularly when we're talking about contracts and some of these issues are quite complex? What's your view on that? If you can just go unmute, we just need you to unmute, sorry.
Sorry.
That's fine.
There's a lot that needs to be done. I mean, the contract itself is not the only thing that governs, the work that has been assigned to the contractor. It's also the public finance, rules and regulations, the laws that exist in the countries that actually stays over and above the contract. But for the parties involved in the contract, what really the rule book is the contract. It's the engineer, the employer and the contractor, are the parties to this. But especially when it comes to, government being the employer, who has a very strong, upper hand, that this party is stronger than the other two parties in the contract. So we really need to look into in the context of when we talk about, what can we do actually within the FIDIC, contractual terms, what can we do in, to address to these issues? I'm sure you can put in many particular conditions into the contract where you give flexibility, the room to negotiate, to bring amendments and all of those things. But we have to ensure that they are aligned with the the public finance rules and regulations that exist in the countries. And the ministers of finance need to understand, these things are real. What happens, in Europe is real. What's happening in China is real, and that is having a real impact on the supply chain. That's having a real impact on the fuel prices, and that's having a real impact on the supply of labor. All of these things are happening. So how do we actually deal with that? We need to have a broad discussion with the government agencies who are involved in implementing these projects and making the payments. We need to bring them in on board, make them understand that these are real situations, and then the FIDIC form of contract allows you to deal with this without contradicting or with the public finance rules and regulations that exist in the country. And if they don't, there has to be an alignment has to be brought to that. It's very important that we do that. As far as I believe, a contract is that's once you have entered into a contract, that's the only rule book you play by. You bring in somebody else only when you go into an arbitration. Three parties should be able to resolve that. Somebody else, should not stay above it. Say for example, let me just give you an example. Say I am an implementing agency in the government, framework. But Minister of Finance is the one who actually releases the payments. So my engineers who actually manage the contract with the consultants and the contractor, they should really have a say in this. And I know this does allow bringing flexibility brings in the fear of corruption and all sorts of things. We have to find a balance. How do we actually deal with it? I'm not saying not give up on the checks and balances. Checks and balances measures has to be brought in and bring in flexibility to that. If we try to deal with this, the point I raised earlier was, we can do this very easily during the time of contract negotiation, if we have really thought about it. But what do we do after a contract has been signed? How does the contract allow us to do that if we hadn't defined these certain particular conditions? The dredging contractors do a very nice thing. Every dredging contract will have a clause for the fuel price escalation. But normal construction contractors don't bring that in. They don't really they don't envisage these sort of things to happen. They also need to be made more aware and educated about this. Of course, this is going to somebody is going to bear the risks of all of this. Of course, it's going to raise the cost of the projects. And governments like to keep things to the lowest possible. But it doesn't happen really. And that is a reality that should exist. So if they don't want to take the risk, then then they should, if they pass it on to the contractors, then, of course you get a higher price for the work that you want. You want to take the risk, get a lower price, and that's the end of it if something happens. So that would be my views on that. I'm not sure if I've actually answered your question or not, but that's my views, is that we need to align things. We need to align things, accepting that this reality exists.
Thanks very much for that. I think there's definitely a need for a discussion and also for a dialogue. I think Manish has helpfully posted something in the chat about FIDIC helping to facilitate a conversation around particularly more collaborative and inclusive contracts. I don't know whether you want to reflect on that for a second, Manish, if I can bring you in just to maybe amplify the point that you've made there, because I think what Mohammed said is actually quite interesting, really, from the point of view of the challenges that we have in this situation.
Sure, Andy. Minister Aslam raises very valid, good points, and so does Etel and Mr. Thamer and Simon. None of this is new. I think the conflicts come, the disasters come, and now every year the numbers keep on increasing. It's $1 trillion a year that's lost in GDPs and things like that. But I think what I was trying to do is, how can we work up the challenge between the banks, the governments, the consultants, the contractors about, what you do in private sector, basically risk pricing, right? So on one hand, there is a pressure of least cost selection, doing amendments to the contracts to put all the risk on the contractor. On the other hand, governments don't want to pay. So I think FIDIC could set up with Tony and Nelson's agreement and in conversation, we could try to develop another mode of at least conversation that is more inclusive of challenging these things one by one, where it is fair pricing. I mean, no contractor bids. I mean, they all bid strategically. So I think if FIDIC could be the medium of trust and a platform to have this conversation between the contractor, the consultants, and the bank's desire to have more and more private sector inclusiveness. Cheapest money is government's money. Anytime you go to the private sector for financing, it's going to cost you more. So I think we have to be honest what it is that we are trying to look for. And as Minister Aslam pointed out, everything is interconnected. Supply chain issues. There is no such thing as an isolate issue. I mean, Thamer is living in a region which has been in conflict since the day one of the region formation. So it's a normal thing. Maybe we can learn lessons, what has worked, what has not worked. So Andy, those were some of my thoughts. And I really commend FIDIC for bringing this panel together, because these are issues that need to be addressed if we want to have a better future. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Manish. I just want to turn back to Simon to get his view on a related matter. When you spoke, Simon, you talked about the need for speed and agility, and also to ensure integrity as well in some of these difficult areas of the country. Given the conversation that we've just had and the points that have been made, how do you think that we can facilitate some of these discussions to be had in a way that basically takes us forward and doesn't end us up, regressing, if you like, back on the old kind of, standard ways of viewing things, when actually what's required here is a different way of working. What's your view on that?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Andy, and thanks so much to Manish for a very positive response in terms of what we can together do. As I said before, that these are unprecedented environments. And I think partnership becomes very important. Partnership between the private sector, the MDBs, and all parties becomes very important. So I just really want to first, before I respond to your question, to emphasize what has been said about the forms of contract. Eventually, that's what binds us together. I know it's easier said than done, but really thinking of some way of collaborative arrangement on how we do work in this particular environment would be very useful. Sort of fixed sort of term contracts where you've got like everything defined does not really work well as we have seen. But in terms of how best we can work in these particular areas, I think one of the things which we really have to focus on is use of technology. I think technology helped us during COVID. I think it can still help us a lot during these times, because in many times these places you do not have access to site for you to do any supervision, but you still have to certify that the works have been done. And I think over the last few years there have been a lot of development technology which are geo-enabled, which can help contractors and consultants more especially to work remotely and still to supervise the work. So I think it's where we could invest more. We have also seen drones being also used a lot in terms of the supervision. So overall, I think we have to invest into technology. And I think this is where, from us as MDB, we look forward to the private sector to come forward with some of these innovative, solutions on how we can supervise works in these particular areas. The other thing is that I think, as has been indicated and everyone has said, that a lot of partnership is required in working in these areas. And in many times when we as a bank go to these areas, there's always the reliance that international companies are the best place. They have a lot of resources and they've got the know-how to go into these areas. But what we have seen when you are dealing with situations like Ukraine, that the local presence becomes very important, especially when you're dealing with contractors, that when you are bidding as a contractor or as a consultant, you need to identify local partners, because local partners are able to maneuver much faster than foreign contractors. So I would really urge contractors and consultants, when they're working in these areas, to identify local partners, people who are on the ground and can help you to implement the projects. That also means from our side as the World Bank or Kuwait Fund for Development, we really have to look at the flexibility that we have in trying to do procurement that take into account these realities, that maybe having large chunks of works that you think one contractor can do does not work. So you have to look at how much work can be done by one contractor, try to look at that also and say, what is the security of supply in terms of this person dealing with maybe 50 kilometers of road? It may require a different arrangement where you chop a work into smaller bits and pieces, which can be managed with security, but at the same time where the local contractors can actually manage. So these are some of the maybe much more collaborative way that we can put in place into working in these particular environments. But again, thank you so much. I really look forward to this discussion on the contract forms and other collaborative way of contracting. I think it's important from the bank perspective. We have like framework agreement. I know FIDIC may not have in their term, but this is sort of a bit of open-ended sort of contracts where you empanel contractors, and also perhaps the work itself may not be fully defined. So you try to go along and define and add on some of the scope of the work as you go. And we found this to be very useful in Ukraine, where the scopes keep on changing almost on a daily basis, and having a fixed contract does not work. So we try to look at other forms of contracting, which are much more flexible to deal with the ground realities. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. I'm gonna turn to Etel in a minute, but just before I do, I just want to bring Tamer back in and just ask you, Tamer. Obviously, there are some quite profound and significant effects of disruption on project delivery and indeed cost when working in some of the the projects that your organisation has had to address. In your view, how can that be best mitigated? What can we do about it? Notwithstanding the fact that there are some serious issues here that we have to deal with. In your experience, how can we best mitigate, some of those disruption and also the spiraling cost?
Yes, thank you, Andy. One of the examples I can share with you now, we have an ongoing project, it's a water supply project in Malawi, where the project is on a basis on the ABC contracting using FedEx, where there was an environmental study pending for approvals. And during the works were during the execution of the work, the project was stalled since the locals, the location of the tank was selected to be on the heritage site. So what happened? We are now under this. The contractor stopped the work, and we are. The issue is in order to. If we approve the environmental study before, we wouldn't have the cost escalation now. So in this context, I would suggest that we should wait for, and I'm sure all of you agree on this, that we should wait for the environmental study first before we proceed with the signing of the contract and have an issue on the site. So that's one of the examples that I would raise. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that. I just wanted to throw this one at Etel, if I may. You mentioned when you spoke, some of the guidance, information, documentation, assistance that the bank and other funders provide to those people that he works with. Do you think there is, and it's come up in the conversation as well in the chat, do you think there's any room for an increase in dialogue between organisations like FIDIC, and I know it's already taking place, and I know that you work very closely, with FIDIC, to sort of, get to the bottom of some of these issues in order to try and map, a way forward? And because obviously there are going to be, difficulties, there are going to be challenges, but surely the point is to try and get over those and to try and solve them for everybody's benefit going forward. So is there a need for more discussion, for more even training, capacity building even around some of these issues? What's your view on that?
Yes, thank you, Andy. I mean, I find the discussion very enriching and very interesting. So thank you also for the good questions you are posing to all the speakers. These are very good questions. I definitively welcome this interaction with FIDIC. I think the bank has adopted a lot of flexibility. And one example is when the pandemic started, we start financing vaccines, which is a completely new sector from the bank. And we issue very short term of contracts, very quick procedures to procure vaccines. Even we accept some different contract conditions with the manufacturers of vaccines that initially were not thought to be accepted anywhere before in our portfolio. So the bank really had exercised a lot of flexibility in adapting the procurement procedures when the outcome, the value for money, this is the key concept, when the value for money prevails. I mean, we need to be flexible to achieve the results and to provide the support to the populations. So I think that Simon already mentioned, it is important we develop with FIDIC small standard form of contract, so we can use them in this kind of conditions or situations. Also, I think the consulting type of contract needs to be also rethought, because I think at some time flexibility on appointing new key staff, different staff, allowing more flexibility to consulting firms to provide these innovations that we are talking about. So I think we have a department in the bank. We are practitioners. We do not change policies. We have a policy department on procurement, head by the chief procurement officer, Enzo De Laurentiis. So I think FIDIC already know him very well. And he also had meetings with Circa, with many other construction industries, also associations, to understand how we can adapt our procedures to this evolving environment. And I think it's important, the dialogue, the partnership, and all the discussions that we are having today to put in practice, with some practice and tools for the consulting and construction industry to provide better services, and also for the employers. And we provide training. I share a few, the link. There is a lot of trainings in our website. We also conduct the business workshop, outreach seminars. So we try to reach out the private sector in each of the countries we work in. Thank you.
Thanks.
Andy.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. Someone mentioned earlier on during the conversation about, and we obviously hope that it doesn't necessarily get to this point, but equally we want to avoid disputes in the medium to long term. Someone mentioned about the role of dispute boards and the role of the dispute and arbitration boards under the FIDIC contracts and how widely these are used. And it seems to me that in a fast-moving situation, like a conflict situation when you're working on a contract, then obviously these bodies could actually be quite useful. I mean, do any of our panelists have a view on that and about how they're used? I can see that Simon's nodding his head, so I'm gonna bring him in first, and just for your view on the DABs and the DAABs. What's your view on that?
Thank you so much. It's always difficult. They shouldn't be nodding your head on the screen. You pick straight away. No, thank you so much, Andy, again for a very good conversation. I think the dispute boards are very important. I think first I should say that perhaps the World Bank and FIDIC, maybe we have a work at hand where we have to educate employers on the dispute boards. Because what we see from us that employers look at these boards as an additional cost. And in many cases, they do not hire them. But only when a dispute arises, then that's when they start looking around for starting to hire them. And as you can imagine, at that time, parties are already in dispute, and it becomes even difficult to agree on the board itself because you're already in under dispute. So I would really want to, I think a lot of people who are on the call to really consider their position on the use of dispute boards. They are very important for the proper working of the contract. In this fragile situation, as I said, working in Ukraine and in other places, these disputes are an everyday happening. So every day my work, just like maybe yesterday, involves every day where there is a contractor coming to the bank. Eventually they find that they don't have any leeway to talk to the employer because the employer has just closed, and they said, we are very busy, we're in a fragile environment, we have much more important thing to do than talking to you. And then the contractor eventually comes to the bank. So the bank starts spending a lot of time trying to negotiate between the parties to come together just to start talking. So I would really encourage our employers to look at this. But I think one of the innovations which I wanted to highlight, Andy, is what FIDIC agreed with the World Bank. I think this came maybe during COVID. This were like emergency dispute boards. I think this was introduced in the context of sexual harassment and how contractors can be disqualified when they're involved in sexual harassment issues. I think the World Bank and the FIDIC, they had put an arrangement of sort of like emergency dispute resolution boards, which are much less traditional. They can be mobilized in a very short period of time, and their decisions can also be made in very period of time. I think this type of arrangement is what we require in this fragile environment, because time is of the essence. We do not have the liberty of time. And if this dispute board can be appointed right at the beginning, they are part of the contract implementation, and they are able to meet and discharge their decisions efficiently. That's what we require. But really calling on FIDIC and all the MDBs to do much more education on the use of dispute boards. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Simon. And there was a very interesting discussion at the recent FIDIC International Contract Users Conference on this very subject, on the use of dispute boards. And I know it's a conversation that it will continue as we hold further events around the contracts issue. And I know it's something that we're particularly keen at FIDIC to raise awareness of. A number of our panelists today have mentioned the role of these boards and whether they're properly understood. We haven't got time to go into that in this particular webinar, but it's certainly something that I think that we need to, to look at going forward. We're almost running out of time, and I'm just going to ask our speakers before I ask Manish to say a few closing remarks. I just want a very, a succinct, takeaway from each of our speakers, if possible. What their view is on how we can move forward around these issues. Maybe there's one sort of golden nugget of a takeaway that you would say is the way that we should be operating when we're working in these situations. So if you can do that in the space of about a sentence, and then we can move to Manish and get his closing remarks. And I'm going to start off with, mainly because his camera's just come back on, and that's Mohammed, just for your, very brief kind of concluding sort of remark, really.
Well, thank you, Andy. I think you can write very well-written contracts, everything covered in it. But it's all about, good management, relationship between the parties, goodwill of the parties to resolve disputes, to resolve issues. No contract is managed by the written contract. It's about those who actually manage and implement the contract. So good relationships, well-trained people, good-mannered people, that's what we need. It's a human thing, Andy. It's a human thing.
Thanks very much. Really important point that about relationships, absolutely crucial. Tamer, your closing thoughts.
Thank you, Andy. I would say the safety of the people performing the contracts in the conflict zone is very important for all parties. And I will emphasize the importance of the partnership between IFIs, and also FIDIC should strengthen the relationship between donors, such bilateral donors, such Kuwait Fund, and the consultancy firms and the other contractors. The relationship and partnership is very important, and the safety of. Thank you.
And I think that point about partnership has shone throughout everybody's contribution here today. Simon, your concluding thought on this issue.
Thank you so much, Andy. Again, thanks for FIDIC for bringing this forward. It's a very useful conversation that we should keep on talking. But I just want also to maybe emphasize what Muhammad said. No contract is complete. Eventually, it's about people. And I think in these particular arrangements, I think it's important for governments to put in place institutional arrangement for dealing with contracts under emergencies. Not everyone has that capacity to deal with it, and having so many people dealing with it, it's very difficult. But if we can have very specialized teams of people trained by the government to deal with the contracts, That's what we need. Thank you.
Excellent. And just finally, Etel, your concluding thought. And I know you probably could speak forever, but we've literally only got 4 minutes left. So try and take a minute and a half.
And I conclude. I think I have little to add. I think flexibility and is key essence from contractors and employers, but also important is to read the contract conditions. Many times employers came to us about whether the contract can be can address the specific situation, and indeed the contract has provision to address the specific situation. So capacity building, reading the contract conditions, being flexible, and also I will welcome this kind of interchange of experiences between all MDBs, IFI, international financial institutions, because I think this forum is very useful for us, but also for the contractor consulting firms. So I think we need to continue maybe to talk about dispute board resolutions and adjudication, how we can address this in the future, and how we can adapt the contract documents to address the challenges. So I encourage FIDIC, thank you for the invitation to organize these events that are very useful. Thank you, Andy.
Thanks very much, Etel. And just finally to say a few concluding remarks, from the perspective of the board and someone who's obviously been intimately involved in developing FIDIC's approach. It's really gratifying to hear the partnership has been mentioned. Manish Kathari, just your concluding thoughts.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, the panelists. I'm very pleased to hear that we all find these conversations useful. Minister Aslam, you couldn't have phrased it well. The continuous impacts of the conflicts and the challenges we face. We don't need the issue in Europe to know about the fragility of energy. We don't need floods to know the world is sinking. We don't need tornadoes and hurricanes all over for the infrastructure demands that we face. We do need to partner, and we do need to partner with progress. I think you also use the word of trust and fairness. And trust and fairness is fundamentally based on all parties coming together for the purpose of a project. And I strongly believe that FIDIC can play a role, not only that, as Etel and Simon and everybody, Mr. Thamer said, through conversations, but to learn from each other. We are all in it together because we are all in it to make a better future for the next generations to come. I'm reminded of a quote which says, never let a serious crisis go to waste. It seems we have a lot of crises going around us, but let us challenge ourselves to find ways of making a better future together. And cheers to a new year and another chance for us to get it right and for a better future for the next generations to follow. And I would be amiss if I don't let Etel know that I'll be rooting for La Alabe Celesta in couple hours for the FIFA World Cup. Thank you, Andy. Back to you.
Thanks very much indeed. I wondered whether we'd be able to get the webinar finished without a mention of football or soccer for those who call it that. But anyway, there we have it. We have had that mention. I think it's really been an excellent event. And just before I close, I just got one final poll question to throw out there to our audience, and that is the effect of sanctions. What effect do they have on organisations and project delivery? And again, it's a multiple choice question. What is the effect on sanctions? Do they have no effect, a marginal effect, a substantial adverse effect, or a positive effect? So cast your vote now, and then we'll basically move to sort of wrap things up. I'm sure we'll get the results of that in a second. So thanks for your participation in that poll. And while that's coming through, yes, we can see that is a substantial adverse effect. And I think I just wanted to say in closing the event, obviously, thank you very much indeed for all of our panelists for being so generous with their views and open with their views as well. I think it's been an excellent discussion, and I think it's one that will continue as we go forward. I've just got a few thank yous to say, obviously, thanks to all of our panelists, to Etel, to Mohammed, to Simon, to Tamer, and also to Manish for their contributions here at the webinar today. I also want to thank as well a member of the FIDIC International Financial Institutions Committee, Richard Crow, who Manish mentioned earlier, has done a lot of sterling work behind the scenes in pulling together the lineup for this particular event. So really thanks to Richard from Nicholas O'Dwyer Consultancy in Ireland. Thank you very much indeed, for that. As I said, I think we've had a really good conversation, a really good discussion. It's one that we'll proceed to have even more of in FIDIC as we move forward. We know it's important to have that dialogue, to have that partnership as we move forward. So we will absolutely continue that over the coming weeks and over the coming months. Just a few last minute announcements before we close things up. We've got a number of different events going forward at FIDIC. As I said in beginning this webinar, this is the last webinar in 2022, but we've got a whole boatload of events in 2023. So do go on the FIDIC website. You can see the URL there, fidic.org/events, and find out the details of our other webinars for next year. Also next year as well, FIDIC's keynote landmark conference, annual infrastructure conference, takes place in Singapore in September. This year's event was a sellout in Geneva. So make sure that you get your name down for the Singapore event as soon as you possibly can. And also, we're keen to continue the discussion. We're keen to continue the dialogue. So do feel free to get in touch with FIDIC on any issue. We've got a fantastic team in the office and beyond at FIDIC, and we're more than happy and able to engage with all of our stakeholders on whatever issue that it may be. Apart from that, it just remains for me to thank everybody for attending. Thanks again to all of our speakers, and we hope to see you again in 2023 at a FIDIC event. We're not quite there yet, but for those who will be enjoying holidays, we wish everyone happy holidays when they come round. But once again, thanks for everybody's participation today, and we'll see you again soon. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.